here comes our guest, Mouthy Infidel. Are we excited? No more spanking discourse. Finally, thank you, Mouthy, for freeing us.
What's the spanking discourse? I'm curious.
So apparently there was like a Prime Kai panel in which people discussed like spanking and stuff and whether or not it was like good or not good for kids we're talking about here. Um, and yeah, there were some people that were not like they don't think it's like it should be like encouraged or should be like the first option or whatever, but should be like in the parents like armory of shit they can do, to like discipline their kids or whatever. So yeah, that's been a thing that's been discussed for the last like day or so, I believe. I'm against spanking generally, just so you know
Oh
my take.
wow.
What about
Yeah,
you?
I was
How do you
way
feel?
off. I thought it had something to do with like a BDSM discourse,
Oh,
like is it abusive to women or something?
oh no no no
Um,
no no no. It's even more like easy to answer than that. It's just like should we beat kids? Yes or no? So
yeah.
yeah.
Shameless plug, there was a did you see that tweet that was going around about like BDSM the other day where it was like some PhD feminist lady said something like it's disgusting that like beating women is okay as long as someone says it's a fetish or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I got like really triggered, so I wrote like a several page long Patreon essay about it. So
Oh
I
really?
was so ready for the BDSM discourse, but
Oh shit, I see,
yes,
I see, I see. Well,
yeah.
hey, if you want to get access to that probably banger of an essay, you would gonna have to check out Mouthy Infidel's Patreon, which would be patreon.com/mouthy_infidel, I would imagine, something like that.
I actually think it's that, but with no underscore.
No
So
underscore. Mouthy Infidel, one word, okay? Sick pro BDSM essay there
yeah.
for fellow BDSM defender enjoyers, okay? That is not, unfortunately, what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about boring econ shit.
Mm.
In the form of social wealth funds. And I don't know like barely anything at all about this really. I've known a little bit, which is what you've told me like very, briefly in DMs. But I'm sure there's a lot more. But before we do that, for the YouTube video and for some people that somehow may not know who you are, feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Mouthy Infidel. I have a YouTube channel called Mouthy Infidel. I have a Twitter called Mouthy Infidel. Um, I'm I mostly just do videos, debates and other sorts of political videos on my YouTube channel about, economics, philosophy, etc., policy. And I have a Patreon account where I uh, write essays for patrons about all sorts of things from, other econ policy related shit to articles defending BDSM, um, all kinds of stuff. But yeah, I mean, uh, I guess you can check that out if you want to. I also want to sort of say, as a quick meta point, that I don't want to be like, I know I came on here to talk about social wealth funds. I really don't want to give the impression that I'm like, the social wealth fund guy or like a social wealth fund like expert or spokesperson or something. I was just asked to come on and talk about social wealth funds. From what I know about social wealth funds, they seem like a pretty good idea. But I mean, there is undoubtedly people who know way more about this than I do, who could give like much more eloquent explanations and defenses of the idea. Matt Brunig, James Medlock, etc. So I just don't want to give the impression that I'm, setting myself up as like some sort of an expert, right? Because there's a lot of shit I'm very ignorant on when it comes to like finance or whatever. Um, but yeah, I can give like the basic idea, arguments for it, etc.
All right, so with that out of the way, yeah, so we're discussing social wealth funds, and I'm just gonna hand it right over to our expert on the topic here right away. So go for it.
Yeah, so a social wealth fund is generally defined as like a collectively held financial fund, which is fully owned by the public and used for the benefit of society as a whole. So this can be called a social wealth fund, it can be called a citizens wealth fund or a sovereign wealth fund. But the basic idea is simple. Basically, you have the government, and the government directly owns a large pool of income-generating assets, so things like stocks and companies, real estate, etc. And then the return on those assets is used by the government for social wealth fund, for social welfare purposes. Um, so basically what happens, so like a basic social wealth fund proposal that I would advocate for is money and assets are placed into the fund that's owned by the government. A public entity then manages those assets in a way that generates investment returns. And every American citizen will get a share of ownership in the social wealth fund. And then those investment returns on the assets in the social wealth fund will be largely paid to the citizens as dividends. In terms of the dividend amount, I'm a fan of the Matt Bruenig proposal, and basically his idea is that the dividend amount should be set equal to a 5-year moving average of a percentage of the social wealth fund's market value. And so like the percentage that's then used, the percentage of returns that's then used to pay out dividends to the people would be set legislatively or by the Treasury, and would aim to basically withdraw an amount that's equal to the inflation adjusted return of the fund. And this idea is basically a hybrid of the way Norway does it and the way that Alaska does it with Alaska's Social Wealth Fund. Just as sort of a final point, in terms of how this connects to, because I originally brought this up to Rosaris privately in the context of socialism. And so just to give a brief explanation of how I think this topic might connect with socialism, is that basically, in terms of how I understand socialism, there are 3 basic types of goods, right? There are capital goods, which are, like factories, equipment, things that are used as like inputs to production. There are non-produced goods, so things like natural resources and land. And then there are consumer goods, things like food, things like clothes, video games, etc., which are just things that like individual consumers consume. And I take socialism to just mean that society as a whole should collectively own, rather than a set of private owners, should collectively own, control, and benefit from the non-produced goods and capital goods in a nation, and then allow for, of course, private ownership of consumer goods. And social wealth funds are just one way of achieving that goal, right? You can take the land, the non-produced assets, and the capital goods and put them under government ownership, under a social wealth fund, through which sort of the people can democratically determine how these things are going to be used, and how the benefits, the revenue which is generated by these things are going to be distributed, etc. And so that's the sort of basic idea. So I mean, wherever you want to go from there, we could get into sort of some of the main benefits of social wealth funds, or um, wherever you want to go.
Yeah, I think I can do a brief summary to make sure I'm on the right page,
Mhm,
and then I have so far like one question.
mhm.
So basically, what social wealth funds are at the end of the day is it's sort of like another way by which to generate like tax revenue, and also have some more form of like a more like indirect influence over operation of certain firms in certain sectors, depending on where you want to put this like sort of like social wealth fund investment in which sectors of the economy and stuff like that. So for instance, the main example, and someone in chat also talked about this, in Norway, a heavy allocation of it is in the oil sector, so they have some more influence there as compared to like other sectors, for instance. And yeah, it's basically a good way to have like democratic influence over some of the biggest sectors, and also be able to garner a massive amount of tax revenue that can be used for a wide range of different social projects. And this is done through, yeah, the government basically acting like a sort of like a private investor, so to say, in which that they buy different like stocks, real estate, etc., those types of examples, and then get revenue from it. Now, my first question was that maybe this varies depending on which social wealth fund we're talking about, but does the government have like controlling or management or voting shares typically, or is it just like ownership where they just get revenue but don't really have a say in how it's run and stuff like that, or does it vary, or is it only one or the other? How does that work?
Yeah. So Well, there's two things there. The first thing that I just want to say is because you brought up a really interesting point, and I don't want to go off on this for too long, but I think it's just sort of worth bringing up because you made the comparison to taxes,
Mhm.
and in a sense that is true because with taxes you're trying to garner government revenue for the government to be used for sort of social welfare purposes, and that's also in some sense what a social wealth fund is doing. But there is a difference in the sense that, or at least there's still sort of benefits of the social wealth fund just beyond that, even purely in revenue terms. So to put it in this way, right, every asset that the social wealth fund owns is basically equivalent to a 100% tax on that asset's returns. And it is very doubtful that a tax rate that high would otherwise be viable if it was just done through traditional taxation, right? Because there are like revenue maximizing rates where if you try and tax something too highly, people will stop actually paying the tax, etc. Which is sort of the idea of a tax elasticity. Or to put it in overall terms, if the social wealth fund owns 50% of the wealth and imposes the maximum capital tax of 32%, which is what that's one estimate for how high a capital tax can be before you start seeing diminishing returns
Mhm.
from one study. Putting together the 50% wealth ownership of the social wealth fund and the 32% capital tax, that would be equivalent to a total tax rate of 66%. Which would be way higher than any of the estimates for the maximum possible
Mhm.
capital tax among economists. So the point is just that while it is just one way of getting revenue, um, we would be able to get way more revenue through having a social wealth fund and also having taxes than we would be able to garner through just having taxes. And then the other point is just that that's not get the other thing which you mentioned, which is control, right? You get sort of
Mhm.
some democratic control over these sectors. And now you asked with respect to that, does the social wealth fund have sort of like a voting share in these companies? And the answer is that it's going to depend on the social wealth fund. I think most don't in a lot of proposals. So I think even funny enough, Hillary Clinton even proposed like um, a social wealth fund in one of her books, or said that she was like interested in the idea, but obviously I'm highly doubtful that she would support like voting shares.
Mhm.
When it comes to Norway, and Norway, I think, is just the prime example of a country that has a massive, like a seriously massive and very successful social wealth fund. Norway actually does have voting shares. So, for example, in 2016, the fund voted at 11,294 shareholder meetings, which is a vote rate of 97.9%. And its voting decisions are based on guidelines which are adopted by the fund and applied in a case by case basis. So the guidelines include things like promote long term value, promote company transparency, promote environmentally and socially sustainable business practices, etc. Um, and so, yeah, so basically, and in addition to that, the fund met with 1,589 companies, a total of 3,790 times to discuss some particular topic of concern. And the key topics included things like board members should have independent industry expertise, board chairpersons should be independent from CEOs, and companies should operate sustainably and respect human rights. And
Mhm.
so, and there's I could go on for a variety of other examples of things that Norway's social wealth fund encourages through shareholder meetings and how it votes and so on.
Mhm.
But the basic idea is that there is real world precedent for the government owning shares. And it seems like, though, of course, right wingers are going to say, like, oh no, this is a path to tyranny and authoritarianism or whatever. It seems like, based on how Norway's social wealth fund actually functions and actually influences the companies that it has shares in, it's actually just pretty productive, right? It's just encouraging things that are good for society
Mhm.
overall.
And to be clear, it's the government buying these shares of the firm, not just like yoinking them, I guess. Just or
Yeah, you could do both,
uh
right? So you could one thing you could do is just sort of build up the social wealth fund through sort of like initial taxes, maybe like land value taxes,
Mhm.
and then sort of use that revenue to buy up sort of publicly traded shares. And no doubt, if we had a social wealth fund, a lot of the shares that the government would own would be just bought with the money that the social wealth fund was able to accumulate. But there is also other ways you can do it, which do sort of just yoink shares that I'm perfectly comfortable with. And in fact, I think that given how much of the United States economy is non-publicly traded at the current moment, I think to some extent you are going to need to do forcible extractions of shares in order for the government to own as much of the economy as I would like. And obviously that sounds kind of weird to a lot of people, but the main thing that we just have to keep into account is that it doesn't have to be any different than like a capital tax. Like you could just do a capital tax and say, oh, by the way, you can also pay us in shares. Or something like that. Like I think Dean Baker proposed something like that, where you just have tax policies where you allow people to pay with shares in their companies and so on, and have the government come to own larger and larger portions of the economy through those means.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. So you can either go the way where you raise money for the social wealth fund first, and then the government invest that social wealth fund into given sectors where they think they're going to get good returns on it, and where they may want particular influence, assuming that they want to go for voting shares, or government can yoink certain shares from certain sectors that they believe it's important to have, so to say. But that could also be accomplished through already existing government methods such as capital gains taxes, which we generally see as acceptable. So it's not like something like brand new, that's like unprecedented, or that's going to be functioning significantly differently from already existing taxes. And furthermore, the differentiation between social wealth funds as a tax revenue source as compared to other sources is that, number one, you're able to just like attain a higher percentage of like taxation. You're able to get that initial, what do you say, like something 30% tax, and then plus 100% tax on the shares that they own. Let's say that they own like like another like a third of a company shares as well. That's roughly another like 30%, and then you get like a 60% tax. And so you're able to accomplish more of that, and then you also don't have to engage in the downward pressure that would come with just directly setting the tax like straight up at 60%, because at that point you're gonna hamper the industry in itself by like putting a downward pressure on their competitiveness, and that's avoided through the social wealth funds because it functions just as an investment when it comes to how that revenue is garnered, rather than from like a market interventionist like tax, so to say. So yeah, you get more taxes, and you avoid like the downward pressure of competitiveness that comes with raising the taxes otherwise. So it's sort of like it skates around that problem pretty nicely.
Yeah, that's basically true. That's pretty much everything that I said. Yeah. And I also just I'm sure you obviously know this, but just to be really clear, I don't want to give the impression that it's sort of like a one or the other strategy when it comes to either just yoinking the shares through like one proposal that I mentioned that was proposed by a guy named Dean Baker is you just have a capital tax and then you allow people to pay that tax in like stocks and so on. So as they need to sort of liquidate their assets to pay the taxes, you can sort of come to own shares in these privately owned companies and so on. Or even, yeah. So, but I don't want to give the impression that it's either you do like that sort of a strategy or you just buy the shares. Because in reality, what I would advocate for is probably a mixture of both of those two strategies. But yeah, other than that, yeah, I agree with everything that you said.
All right, great, sounds good. Yep, and that's what I had questions at the moment. So let's go into some of those benefits you were talking about.
Oh yeah, so I think I've mostly
Covered most of them.
yeah, I think I've mostly, the two main ones are just revenue and democratic control, right? So with respect to revenue, and it's also important to understand how revenue sort of connects with inequality and poverty, right? So one thing that we need to understand, right, is that there's already there's like currently $5 trillion of capital income just exists in our current economy, right?
Mhm.
And so this is sort of like $5 trillion in passive income that's just paid out to people with no strings attached and without them having to work for it. It just flows to people as a condition of their owning capital, right? And so
Assuming there's no
currently,
capital gains tax, right? That would be.
right, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and even if there are capital gains tax, you're still getting a lot of money and yeah, you're still getting a lot of money, obviously, from your capital ownership that just passively flows to you,
Mhm.
but you're just having some of it taxed, yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and so the idea is that currently this creates this situation where you have all of this money flowing to people who own capital. It creates a large amount of inequality and poverty because capital ownership is distributed very unequally, right? I could give statistics on that, but I'm sure everybody already knows this.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, it's
at
basically
least
like
in the
who's
U.S.
most likely to like own assets that passively generate income? Is it going to be, like person that, with a high school diploma working at Walmart, or is it going to be somebody with like a very expensive savings account at one of the major banking institutions? It's going to be the wealthier person there, obviously. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Um, And so basically, the idea is that we have this $5 trillion in capital income that just flows passively to people, but it only flows passively to a small amount of very wealthy people in terms of a percentage of the entire population. And so if we used a social wealth fund to bring all of that capital or a large amount of that capital under common ownership and allowed that massive amount of capital income to be distributed among the population as a whole in terms of like a dividend, this would massively reduce inequality, right? Because you're evening out capital ownership, which is a large source of income. And it would massively decrease poverty, right? Because now everybody's getting a lot of money because they have an ownership stake in this social wealth fund that's getting a lot of revenue from these income generating assets.
Yeah, because fundamentally
And so,
the
yeah,
social programs are going to be funded by the tax revenue going to obviously disproportionately go towards individuals that won't be owning other assets which generate money from this passively floating around 5 trillion in capital gains. So it balances itself out there, yeah.
yeah, and one way that you could do the revenue thing, and this is Matt Brunig's proposal,
Mhm.
is that you give everybody, so everybody obviously has an ownership stake in the social wealth fund, and then you create what he calls like a universal basic dividend, which is sort of the idea is that it's sort of like a UBI, but it's paid for through the revenue that's generated in the social wealth fund rather than through taxation.
Mhm.
And so basically, you have everybody who has an ownership share in the social wealth fund, and therefore they get dividends from the revenue that that social wealth fund generates, and um, and those the amount of those dividends is equal to like a certain percentage of the amount of revenue that the social wealth fund brought in.
Mhm.
And when you sort of start to look at the numbers, if we got like a significant portion, if we even got an amount of capital ownership in the social wealth fund
Mhm.
in the US that was like equal to what Norway has, right? We would have enough money to fund a UBI along the lines of like what Andrew Yang is proposing. And if we sort of got to a situation, the sort of market socialist dream
Mhm.
where the vast majority of the economy is, or the vast majority of capital is owned under the social wealth fund, then we would have enough revenue to fund a UBI that's like well over $1,000 a month,
Mhm.
right? And so this could like single-handedly like massively reduce poverty, almost end poverty, massively reduce inequality, and better the lives of millions of people.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean that all sounds really interesting and something I can just like semi related to this specifically. Hey, if you personally, person watching this, you thought you think like investment that type of thing is pretty cool, but alas, your progressive or like socialist or left leaning values make you feel like bad for doing that type of thing because it's like private incentives. Hey, imagine a world in which we have a social wealth fund and the government hires you to make based investments that are going to benefit the people at large and bring in a fuck ton of tax revenue. That would be that's a cool fucking job. Okay, the only investors I respect. Okay, the social wealth fund investors and speculators and the rest of it. But yeah,
Yeah.
um, no, but that sounds very cool. I'm definitely going to like incorporate this just generally when it comes to my economic policy because
Mm.
yeah, this all sounds pretty good. I mean, thinking of potential negatives, it feels like the biggest like road hump to this would be just like anything that has to do with like state or government ownership or control is immediately going to set up like 69 million alarm bells on the conservative camp of like a democratic process, and that might be like kind of difficult to overcome. So in that process, maybe it would be easier to like focus primarily on like non-controlling or non-voter shares, at least in the short run. um, but that's more of like an issue of like, I suppose, like pragmatism and working within the political process than necessarily like a flaw in the policy in itself. But overall, this
Mhm.
sounds pretty good. Has there been anything like when it comes to like Norway, any like negatives or bad outcomes that have arisen from this, like problems, so to say, that they had to address or that they still haven't addressed, or does it just generally look pretty good?
Yeah, there's not any massive problems that Norway's faced that I'm aware of. It seems to have worked out pretty well. Um, in fact, um, this idea that, and you sort of touched on maybe one concern that might be pertinent to conservatives is that conservatives sort of have this idea that when you have the government running something, it's just going to be super inefficient. You know,
Mhm.
like what's that like dumb Milton Friedman quote where he's like, if the government ran the desert, we'd run out of sand or some shit like
Yeah.
this. Um, and so that just turns out not to be true.
Mhm.
Especially when it comes to social wealth funds. So, like, if you look at Norway's social wealth fund, one of the main ones is called GPF Global.
Mhm.
And GPF Global's expenses in 2017 were equal to 0.06% of its assets under management. And GPF Norway's expenses, which is its other social wealth fund, were equal to 0.07% of its assets.
Mhm.
And these are expense ratios that are near the lowest in the world, even when comparing them to like private asset management and private index funds.
Mhm.
Um, and this is despite the fact that Norway's social wealth funds are actively managed. Um,
Yeah, I
and
mean
so it
mhm.
seems like, yeah, Norway's government management of its social wealth fund is incredibly efficient. Alaska also has a social wealth fund with respect to its oil, and it's one of the most popular programs in the state. Alaska is obviously not a very left-wing state, but people
Mhm.
love the social wealth fund there. It's worked out really well. So yeah, and I mean, those Alaska and Norway are probably the two most relevant examples, obviously, because Alaska's in the U.S. and Norway is actively managing it, and it has grown a social wealth fund that's probably, I think, the biggest in the world. Um, but I mean, there are just countless other countries that have a social wealth fund. I think the number is um, at the beginning of 2016, the globe was home to around 80 social wealth funds spread across more than 60 governments, with most of the funds being established after the year 2000s. And so the existence of this many social wealth funds that tend to be pretty effective sort of prove that a government can own and manage large pools of income generating assets without significant problems.
Mhm.
Um, and one final point is just that whatever issue you can think of with the social wealth fund, sort of as a capitalist, you're going to have to explain why that doesn't apply to um, sort of already existing index funds, which largely already dominate the economy, right? Um, and so Matt Brunig has this interesting article called "Index Funds Are Proof of Concept for Market Socialism," and he basically shows that, look, all a social wealth fund is having an index fund, except the government is the owner of the index fund,
Mhm.
right? And so index funds are obviously just like you have a bunch of people who have ownership in this index fund, and then the index fund buys up different shares in different companies, and creates this sort of diverse portfolio. Um, and So the idea is just we already have this, right? And why would the government suddenly doing it instead of a private index fund suddenly introduce some economic problem that doesn't exist with the private owners of the index fund?
Mhm.
And it seems like someone would be like hard pressed to come up with I guess, a symmetry breaker there.
Yeah.
Um,
And one of the major differences between like what a lot of people would imagine when you talk about like government like control or influence is that fundamentally like this is still very much working within like a market, right? Like in most situations, depending on what sectors and how much you heavily invest, like you still have like these firms which are could be majority managed by, like private, stakeholders still. And it's very much different from like what a lot of people imagine, which is like, oh, like a social wealth fund in oil. Does that just mean like the government just like owns the oil sector and runs it entirely, like takes it out of like the Norwegian market then and only uses the global market? I mean, no, it's working within existing markets, but with more of a government influence. So it's not like it's like an abolition of markets or anything like that. So to say it's just, putting the government incentive into a marketplace and plugging that in there really nicely. And fundamentally, like the interest of a government there in the investment structure of a social wealth fund is going to be pretty much the same as any other private investor, right? They're going to act in their own interest. They're when their primary interest, if not their primary interest, is going to be make as much profit as possible, generate as much tax revenue as possible, and be able to then wheel it out to the population through different like wealth programs, and then also like auxiliary goals of potentially like sustainability and stuff like that, in order to be able to sustain like your national economy or like the planet as a whole in the long term to ensure that this continues. Is also like a sort of like personal or like investor side interest there that most people would also have. So yeah, like overall it's really like it's a far reach from like the government just comes in and does everything. It's working within the market and with very very similar interest to what just like a regular private investor would have, but the outcomes and the consequences of that aren't just concentrated among a small percentage of private individuals, but they're shared among the population as a whole, and especially among those people who tend to be the most disadvantaged and most poverty stricken, and struggle with tapping into that like 5 trillion floating pool of money that is only accessible through capital gains otherwise.
mhm. Yeah, and one thing you said there I thought was interesting was and this sort of raises an interesting one of the because you talked about how it's not sort of the same as direct government control,
Mhm.
and that has been a pretty popular sort of blow to or argument against sort of the idea of socialism is just that look, some industries probably work better nationalized, right? Like healthcare is probably one of them
Mhm.
that seems to do pretty well when it's nationalized. But also, some industries seem to work better with a market, right? Like food distribution seems to work better with a market.
Most
When
commodities
we
and
have
luxury goods as well.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And
Mhm.
like when we've seen countries like the Soviet Union try to plan everything, it generally hasn't worked out very well.
Mhm.
And so basically, what most serious people have concluded is that some sectors work good for nationalization, some sectors need a market. And so, therefore, the idea that we should have public ownership over every sector is just implausible, right? So, we
Mhm.
should have private ownership in some sectors, public ownership in other sectors, and that's just the way it has to be given our empirical evidence. Um, and I would say that that's mostly true. But the problem is so public ownership generally comes in two different forms, right? So you have general government services like education, healthcare, and social assistance.
Mhm.
And then you have state-owned enterprises, things like utilities, transit systems, and the post office. And when people say um, some sectors just work better with private ownership and public ownership than with public ownership, it's because they're only considering those two kinds of public ownership, right?
Mhm.
So, because things like commodities and food are not suitable as general government services or socially owned enterprises, state-owned enterprises rather,
Mhm.
they therefore should not be done publicly, or these sectors should not be publicly owned, right? But the thing is, right, there's this third kind of public ownership, and it's the kind that we've been mentioning,
Mhm.
which is a social wealth fund, where the government isn't directly controlling it. Like it's not a completely state owned enterprise, but it's rather the government just sort of intervenes in a market by buying up stocks in the various companies in those markets, and then exerts the sort of indirect control over the companies in that market, right? And any of the sectors that people will reference that clearly aren't suitable as general government services or state-owned enterprises, any of those sectors presumably would be suitable for public ownership in the form of a social wealth fund intervening. And so the idea is just that a social wealth fund provides a way through which we can say that, yeah, the public actually can own everything, right? And it sort of navigates around that empirical pragmatic concern about the efficacy of socialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, just generally, this has to do with more like less. I guess this is just for most like fields of study or just general like social issues as a whole. Generally, reductions in dichotomized thinking tends to be a lot better, and it's very important. Some more nuance, breaking apart from like, okay, there's this type of this and this type of this, and that's all that really like exists, and that's all that's happening. It's going to be beneficial, such as like what you pointed out here. There's multiple different types of like public like ownership or public control that aren't just low government comes in and owns everything. And then yeah, like you pointed out, it's all about like looking at different ownership structures and examining different sectors. So things like education and healthcare, and education is a very big one for me personally, given the situation of like private education right now in Sweden. Are sectors that just seem to work better like in the sort of like traditional or like the most well-known publicly owned sense, and while a lot of other like food markets and especially luxury good markets tend to work better privately. But once again, that's sort of where the discussions ended previously. But now, hey, we're introducing new forms of, or like not necessarily new, but other forms, lesser known forms of public ownership as well, that don't have like the massive sort of like rupturing effect on markets as like like a lot of previous conceptualizations of what public ownership has. It more works within the up market and works just as like a private investor or a private actor would. But it just has a bunch of other like exclusively positive outcomes to it that can't be attained through other forms of like policies like taxation and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like if the typical concern about socialism is like, look, of course there are these big benefits of public ownership. The benefits that are created by a sector gets to be distributed more equally rather than just to a small sect of private capitalists. And it allows us to like internalize externalities better. The idea there being like, obviously, when companies are acting within a market, they often have an incentive to do things which are broadly harmful to society as a whole. And if you have the government having some influence in that sector, the government will be more so incentivized to internalize those externalities and keep the companies that they control from doing things that are harmful to society as a whole, even if they're profitable to that individual company. Um, and so sort of somebody might say, sure, public ownership has all of these benefits, right? Decreasing inequality, decreasing poverty, internalizing externalities, etc. But unfortunately, it just doesn't pragmatically work because some sectors of the economy just seem to work better with markets. And a social wealth fund just says, hey, you can get all these benefits of public ownership while also leaving intact the basic structure of a market, right? And if you want to say that that's not possible, well, you're just wrong, because we already have index funds that dominate large parts of the economy, which do this exact thing. They own different competing companies in individual sectors and influence them and get the revenue from them, and it seems to work out fine. So yeah, I think that's basically the idea.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sounds base as fuck typically,
Mhm.
from what I've heard right now. Yeah, so it's definitely gonna be something I'm gonna think about a whole lot more. So I guess, did you have any other point you wanted to touch on this specifically, or is that your
Um,
notebook done for the moment?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else. Of course, I mean, there's certain arguments that people will make against social wealth funds,
Hmm.
and so on. Don't think they tend to work, obviously, but we don't have to go that deep into any of that. But yeah, I guess just the final note is just to say, like, um, this is something that one of the big problems with socialism that I think you and I share, or sort of some models of socialism, and whether or not you want to call, like, if we both advocated for like a majority social wealth fund dominated economy, whether or not you want to call that socialism is completely up to whoever's advocating for it. That conversation isn't super interesting to me. But fuck, wait, where was I going with that? I just totally oh yeah, but if one of the typical concerns about socialism that you and I both share, at least when we talk about like co-ops, for example, the idea is just like, sure, this sounds like a good idea, but it just like hasn't been tested, right? Like we've never seen a country that's tried to like mandate co-ops or something. And so we just have this sort of empirical gap in our knowledge where we can't really be confident that this is going to work out how we want it to work out, right? And the nice thing about a social wealth fund is that that's not the case, right? There are like 80 social wealth funds across the world. They all work out pretty well. There's a massive social wealth fund that's pretty much identical to the one that I'm advocating for in Norway. It works out really well on pretty much every metric. We have a social wealth fund in Alaska that pays out a universal basic dividend to or something like that to its citizens. It works out really well. It's super popular. And we also just have the comparison to index funds, right? Like if index funds work where private companies are doing this, there's no obvious reason why it would suddenly become super inefficient and harmful for the government to do the exact same thing. And so the nice thing about a social wealth fund is that they're not at all empirically untested, right? We know they work efficiently. They have in numerous cases, and there are a bunch of obvious benefits. So it's just sort of like, why not,
Yeah. I mean that all sounds really good. So you mentioned you said that you had like a few like common counter arguments in mind. Unless we've already, because we've gone over like I think like one or two already. If you haven't gone over them yet, were like the two most like common ones against like social wealth funds, or is it already the things we've noticed such as like government control or like, oh, it's socialism, it's not going to work like publicly within these markets or whatever?
Yeah, so I think some of those are probably the big ones, like, oh, if you have the state administering this, it's going to be super inefficient, or these sorts of appeals, which I've already dealt with. There are some more sophisticated arguments. So for one, there's this one common argument which basically says that if you allow the same investors to own all the firms in a given sector, then this will sort of result in those firms raising their prices because you're sort of undercutting a competitor on price. So like, for example, like undercutting a competitor on price may be good for your firm individually, but if your firm's competitor also owns, but if your firm's owners also owns your competitors, then this kind of competition hurts your investors' bottom line. So if I own like Burger King and McDonald's, if I only own McDonald's, it's good for me to lower my prices. So then I get to sort of undercut Burger King. But if I also own Burger King,
You can raise prices
then
pretty much, right?
yeah, exactly. Like you don't have as much of an incentive to undercut because you own both the companies. So what's the point? If anything, it hurts you to do that. And so there is one study that I can send you a link to that basically analyzes this with respect to the big three index fund companies that exist, that being Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. And so in this paper, what the authors do is they distinguish between intra-industry common ownership, which refers to a situation where many of the firms inside a given industry are commonly owned, and they contrast that with inter-industry common ownership, which refers to a situation where a common owner owns firms across many different industries. And what they found is that intra-industry common owners tend to increase prices, while inter-industry common owners tend to decrease prices. And obviously that makes sense, right? Because price hikes in one industry has negative effects on other industries, which an intra-industry common owner does not care about, but which an inter-industry common owner does care about,
Okay, I
right?
see.
And so the big three index funds companies are sort of like universal owners, meaning they have common ownership across the entire market. So they're both intra and inter-industry common owners, and as a result, they're tugged in both of these directions when it comes to prices. And ultimately, the authors of the study concluded that the net effect of these conflicting pressures is ultimately lower prices, not higher prices. So the lower price incentive wins out. And so basically, the idea there is that sure, it might be the case that a social wealth fund would be an inter-industry or an intra-industry common owner, which has a pressure which would likely be inflationary. There are also inter-industry common owners, which creates a pressure for them to decrease prices, and the overall net effect of these conflicting pressures will lead to a situation where, in fact, a social wealth fund is not leading to increased prices.
Yeah. So just to make sure I understand this, basically, so that study you talked about, they analyzed two different types of investment types. So there is like sort of like intra investments, which intra it's like within, so like investments within one given like sector of an economy, and then inter, which is like investment in different types of sectors of the economy. So basically, when a firm engages, or like when a wealth fund or an index fund engages only in intra, so within a sector investment, then this is a reasonable concern, right? Because they own the different parties. It's kind of like a similar effect to what like an oligopoly or what a monopoly does generally in an economy. They can afford to raise prices, and because there's no like competition, because they kind of have like seats at every table, they can get away with this. However, if that same firm owns like of the same like sort of investment firms owns stakes and shares in multiple sectors, that simply doesn't happen anymore, because there is a lot of interplay between the different sectors of the economy in a nation or in a global economy even. So if one of these sectors, let's say we're talking about manufacturing, let's say we're talking about like steel, for example, suddenly like raises their prices significantly, then hey, well, that makes that sort of sector like less competitive and just more expensive generally. That's going to have negative effects for a bunch of other sectors that this wealth fund also owns. So it's not going to be in their best interest to make sure that the steel one goes up. And that's actually exactly what happened with Trump's tariffs, and that's why they failed so much. Is you didn't take into account the effects that like a tariff on one specific sector had. So, for example, taxes on steel and aluminum. Hey, their employment increased, but the rest of manufacturing got absolutely dumpstered because they didn't consider the effects that hey, this sector, having more employment and raising prices, sure, it might be good for that sector, but every other sector that interacts with the steel aluminum sector is going to suffer from that dramatically. And even if it is a sector that doesn't directly interact with one another, like for example, the example with the burgers, like it could be like, oh, what other firm needs like burgers to like get by or whatever. Well, what's still going to end up happening is the consumer base is going to lose out on disposable income just generally because burgers are going to be more expensive. And therefore, they're not going to have much money to spend in other sectors. So even in those situations where sort of the different sectors aren't directly in collaboration with one another, like a reduction in competitiveness and an increase in prices in one of them is still not going to be beneficial for like the rest of the sectors, and it's going to harm them as a whole. So that concern with them having all seats at the table and raising prices overall would be a valid concern, assuming that these wealth funds only invested in one sector. But as long as they invest in multiple sectors, it is safe to assume, and also given the empirical evidence you just provided, it's probably going to be the case that that's not going to happen, because they have an interest to keep all these sectors competitive. Because if they don't, then they're going to suffer from the dependencies and relationships between the different sectors.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And one other thing is just that, so that's sort of one more, the concern about prices is sort of one more specific type of argument that's sort of in a broader family of arguments that's sort of concerned about what will be the negative impacts on competition if you have this one social wealth fund that sort of commonly owns all of these different competing parts of the economy. Will there be any negative impacts on competition if that's the case? And the first thing to say about that is just we haven't really seen any evidence of that. Obviously, Norway has a tremendous amount of state ownership over the economy. So I think the precise statistic is that like 6 out of every 10 kroner in Norway is actually owned by the state. Like the percentage of the country's overall wealth that's owned by the state is absolutely enormous in Norway, bigger than even in like China, for example. And we haven't seen any evidence of like significant harms to Norway's economy because of that. Norway seems to be doing pretty much fine in terms of competition and entrepreneurship and GDP growth and all of that stuff, and innovation as well. And But I mean, that's not going to be the greatest evidence because there might still be some small effect. It's just not perceptible on the sort of macro statistics. But another thing is just that to the extent that this is true, even if this was true, even granting that premise, which I don't think is particularly compelling, or I'm not, we don't really have strong empirical evidence either way, but I don't feel particularly compelled to sort of grant that empirical premise just on sort of an a priori intuitive basis. But even granting that that was true, there is a very easy fix to this, which is just that, sure, if we can't have everything be owned by the same social wealth fund and still have competition go well, we can just break up the social wealth fund into multiple different competing social wealth funds that are all still owned by the state, but are competing with one another. This is actually something that Norway has been proposing or sort of playing with the idea of doing this. And so that just provides, like, the fact that we can do that just provides a very easy fix to any concerns about social wealth funds being too big or anti-competitive.
Yeah, and that's also like I suppose like a counter to the previous like issue. We like, even if we didn't have that study with the intra and inter competitiveness and like investment and stuff like that, that could still work as a fix for that as well. So yeah,
Mhm.
basically just to reiterate to make sure I understand and maybe explain a different way. Yeah, so an issue with maybe like one big social wealth fund owning like way too much across an entirety of an economy can result in just general like, reduction of competitiveness because, generally you have like one big actor controlling a lot of stuff. And because of that you may see like, yeah, income and like non-competitive, like inefficient allocation of resources or whatever within an economy. Solution, very simple. Bang, take the big, social wealth fund, break it up into a bunch of small ones, make them compete with one another, set up some form of like incentive structure for that competition, and there you go. You've completely solved that issue, and you still retain all the positives. And if any, it might even be more efficient now because not only do you have competition between the social wealth funds and rest of private investors, but now you also have competition between the different social wealth funds and the other, investors as well. So, yeah,
Mhm.
that's a very, very efficient and quick fix to that issue.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, excellent. So those are the main two issues, and excellent solutions to them as well provided.
Mhm.
Um, So overall, I can just I can sum up really quick, just generally, what we've been talking about. So social wealth funds are basically similar to an index fund from private markets, in which the government sets aside a portion of capital and uses this to invest in a wide range of different sectors within mostly a domestic economy, I would assume. And this investments can lead to just like, voting shares, to management shares, to controlling shares, to just like general ownership that just generates income but doesn't actually give any control of the firm in itself. The main purpose of this is that it does two things. Number one, it's a great source of tax revenue. It circumnavigates a lot of issues when it comes to tax elasticities that would come from just raising the tax as a whole, because through this way you're working within the market rather than intervening on the market. And furthermore, it just generates, a potential, a lot of money and can build into just general competitiveness from having more investors within a firm as a whole or within a sector as a whole. And yeah, not downward pressure on competitiveness. And then furthermore, depending on what type of sector, you can also get through a number of sort of like democratically agreed upon principles that you want to sort of enforce through the control in these sectors. So for instance, if you're talking about specific like oil sectors or stuff like that, you can enforce certain like sustainability regulations and suggestions when it comes to stuff like that, more transparency and a lot of the other things you mentioned there. So it's pretty beneficial to that way as well. There's wide different ways by which this could be done. You could have one big social wealth fund. You can break them up. You can, have ones that preferably invest in a wide range of different sectors to prevent the inter investment issue that could potentially arise. And basically, at the end of every year, there is a inflation adjusted like withdrawal that is then used towards a wide range of different social programs within the nation. That's going to disproportionately like benefit people that have a hard time tapping into that floating cachet of like capital gains generally. And this will generally just reduce poverty, reduce inequality, and make everyone more or less better off. So yeah, fundamentally it's working within the market, doesn't require the abolition of one, and is a nice sort of like middle ground between public ownership and private ownership that is not very often considered.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary, and I guess there's So there's a couple other things that I just sort of want to mention before ending here. There's a couple things. So, like, for one of the big complaints that socialists have had about, social democracy is this idea that um, if you get like these sort of temporary fixes, like welfare policies, like, the New Deal in America, for example, you're still going to have this tension where you still have this capitalist class who has a lot of inequality, who's still going to be trying to um, sort of take away those policies because they're harmed by them. And so you still have this class of people who have an interest in getting rid of these sort of social democratic fixes. I don't find that argument as persuasive as a lot of lefties do, just on sort of an empirical level. Like a lot of lefties think that this is some sort of like an inevitability, that this is always going to happen, when it seems like there hasn't really been much evidence of that, at least with respect to like the Nordic social democracies and so on, where aside from Sweden, which I think scaled back a lot of its social programs because of an economic collapse that sort of affected a lot of countries worldwide, most of the social democracies have had pretty consistent levels of social spending and tax revenue. But to the extent that that is a legitimate concern, a social wealth fund just completely does away with that, because it basically liquidates the capitalist class, right? There is no longer a class of people who are getting super rich from capital income, who then have incentives which diverge from the incentives of the rest of society, right? Because now everybody just owns all of the capital. And so there's no such concerns. There's also no concerns about like capital flight, where like if the idea of social democracy is like, oh, if you try to tax corporations too much, they'll just go somewhere else, right? Well, if we have a social wealth fund, that's not really going to be a concern, because the people who own the capital are the people of the country, not like these separate private owners who have incentives to like leave if tax rates get too high and so on. And there's also just one final point. This isn't going to be like as concrete. This is more of some sort of like a hippie appeal, I guess. But there's also just the idea of like, so one of the ways you can do a social wealth fund, the way you sort of described it, is that you sort of use it to finance all these different, government spending programs. Like maybe use it to finance roads, maybe you use it to finance like certain specific welfare policies. One of the things that Matt Brunig proposes that I like is that you just have like, basically you just have a universal basic dividend where every citizen in the country just has an ownership share, and so they're just entitled to a direct like cash check that's equal to a certain amount of the revenue that the social wealth fund brought in. And so this would end up just being functionally like universal basic income, but funded by the social wealth fund. And there is sort of like this idea of sort of community, or feeling more like engaged with, or more like an active member of your country and your community, if you feel like, hey, I have like a direct ownership share in the wealth of my country and in the land of my country and so on. And so there's something that feels like sort of nice about that, but I would never use that as like a primary argument, because it's,
Yeah.
it's not
I
like an
can already
empirically
predict what the main conservative counter argument against that the dividend model is going to be.
what's that?
Okay. Why the fuck, okay, are we letting in these migrants that marginally, by fractions of a percentage point, reduce my total share once they become citizens, huh? What the fuck is this bull? That's gonna be it, okay? I'm
Yeah,
calling it right now. And then you're gonna have to, and then the answer to that's gonna be then, well, migrants generally like expand the economy as a whole. So yeah, sure, you might get like a percentage-wise a smaller slice of the pie, but the pie is gonna grow more like substantially. Then your slice is gonna shrink, so generally, like your returns will be higher overall, and more people will get the returns as well. So more people will benefit from it. So, yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
that's just something I could imagine being the case. But yeah, no, I definitely see what you mean there. And like you could make, even though I understand that's not like a one of the key arguments you'd ever want to make. You could do like more reading on like, or like maybe if you try to like back it up empirically with like arguments that stem from things like social cohesion when it comes to that specific thing of being like an active member of society, and having a participatory force to like a common dividend or whatever. And that could probably like potentially empirically have potential like beneficial outcomes when it comes to like cooperation and trust and trusted institutions and the process of stuff like that. But I understand, like in a vacuum, like without those numbers like on hand, it's probably a rough argument to make. But I think there's probably some empirical stuff to be found there that could help out that argument quite a bit. But yeah, that was good.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
excellent.
And one final thing I just wanted to mention, and another I swear this is I just keep thinking of like new
No
things.
worries.
I was very unorganized coming into this conversation. One final thing that I want to mention is that one of the main benefits of a social wealth fund, at least for like if we're being like time specific here, is that we have this problem, although I'm skeptical as to how much it actually is going to be a problem, but a lot of people are concerned about this problem of automation. Um,
Mhm.
where the idea is it's just going to become so much more cost efficient for companies to like hire robots and hire AI to do the work more efficiently and at a lower cost than workers are able to do it. And so a lot of workers are going to be displaced, right? And so what you have with automation, if these concerns turn out to be true, is a situation where people who own capital, their income is booming because the capital is becoming much more profitable.
Mhm.
Whereas people who earn labor income, I mean, these are the two sorts of income you can have in a capitalist society: is labor income and capital income. And capital income is booming while labor income is decreasing because they're becoming more and more unemployed. And this is a problem in our current society because this leads to higher amounts of poverty and inequality because obviously only a small amount of very rich people own capital income and the vast majority of people only have labor income. But if you have a social wealth fund, you make it so that everybody in the country is benefiting from the capital income rather than just a small amount of capitalists. So you get a situation where automation is actually a boom to everybody in the country,
Mhm.
um, rather than something that harms most people and benefits a very small minority of people.
Yeah, no, but that's actually really good. That's probably one of the honestly like one of the better previously it's just like, oh, the solution is just like, well, like adapt to like a, the current economy. So things like, okay, sure, like things like manufacturing aren't going to be things, but they're going to be like service jobs or more technological jobs are going to like arise, and for that you need heavy investments in education or whatever, and that's probably like a decent way to get to a lot of it. But coupled with the social wealth fund and the fact that basically the theory that you just explained being that, hey, without it, capital ownership, owning capital of like an automation machine, who's going to own the capital? It's going to be wealthy people. It's going to exacerbate inequality. Hey, social wealth funds own some of that automation. Bang, it's going to come to the people as well. So it's gonna even out that way, and that's going to be like a really good way as well to spread out the benefits there as well. So it's unironically probably a pretty good like, I suppose, like not necessarily like solution, that's probably pretty broad, but like a great policy to account for and to yeah, to go over and deal with automation as a whole. So pretty
Mhm.
cool stuff.
Yeah.
All right, well, yeah, that's what I had in mind. I've already summarized everything like six times, so I'm not gonna do
Mhm.
another summary. But yeah, feel free to oh, wait, hold on, this is important. Okay, can you say higher, like to like hire someone for a job?
Higher.
There's something Irish like or Scottish when you say that particular word. I don't know what it is. There's something there's something that sticks out there. Like I was just listening to you, and when you said that, I was like, what the fuck? That sounds. That, okay. Well, I just thought I'd point that out, and we'll see what if Chad agrees with me or if I'm just imagining things. I'm terrible with accents, so I might just be completely wrong, but who knows? Um, but
We'll
yeah.
see, I guess.
Is there anything final you wanna like mention or like shout out before we call it?
Um, well, I think I've said pretty much everything that I needed to say. Yeah, I think social wealth funds are pretty cool, but I'm always open to hearing if anybody has any like critiques or counter arguments that I haven't encountered before. Feel free to just like DM me or comment on one of my videos or something. I'm always open to criticism. Um, but yeah, if you want to check out my content, it's just Mouth the Infidel on YouTube and on Twitter or on Patreon. Um, but yeah, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed this conversation. Um, thought it was productive. So yeah,
Yeah, sounds good. And just one final time, who are you?
I am Mouthy Infidel.
All right, and you can find you on YouTube and on Patreon and on Twitter and all those other cool platforms. All right, great. Well, thank you very much for coming on here and what's the contemporary pill? Before people use like red pill unironically, and then blue pill came up, like, and then there was some bread pill in between. What's the correct pill at this point?
Um, hmm.
Social pilled?
Social wealth pilled.
So swift build, swift pill. I don't know, green
True.
pill, black pill. I don't know. We're pill pilled. Okay, that's what's happening.
Yes.
All right, thank you for
I,
pill pilling
I've
me.
I've lost track. I stopped taking my pills.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
Dangerous.
All right. Well, thanks for pill pilling us all on the social wealth funds, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. See ya.
Bye bye.